Non-duality. It is the most challenging concept we can deal with, whether we approach it from a philosophical perspective or whether we approach it as spiritual teachers and want to raise our consciousness. It's the most challenging concept we can deal with because we can't think our way to grasping non-duality. You see many people who think that non-duality is just like any other topic. We can understand it with the mind, the thinking mind, the linear mind, the analytical mind, the intellectual mind. And many people, especially from the West, where this way of thinking has had such a dominance now for a long time, they think that we can understand non-duality. But you cannot. You cannot understand non-duality. What are your options? Well, you can experience it or you cannot experience it. If you think you understand non-duality but have not experienced it, you are worse off than if you have neither understanding or experience. Because then you think you understand something, but you don't. So what you can do is you can come to an understanding of why you can't understand non-duality. And that will make it easier for you to get to the point where you can either have a non-dual experience or realize that you have already had non-dual experiences in your life. In fact, many spiritual people have had non-dual experiences, often without recognizing it, because as we grow up, we're not given any knowledge about it. We have no way of evaluating these experiences. So what I'll do in this series of talks is I will give some thoughts about non-duality that can hopefully help clear up a lot of the confusion around non-duality. I started writing about non-duality 20 years ago, and back then there was not a lot of talk about it. What has happened since then is that there's been an increase in interest in the topic. In fact, what has happened is that non-duality has become almost fashionable. It's almost trendy to talk about non-duality. And you can find many different videos on YouTube where different teachers talk about it from different backgrounds. And the way they talk about it, the way they define non-duality, they're not always compatible. So if you watch a selection of these videos, you can end up very quickly getting confused. What exactly is non-duality? What is it going to do for me? What practical value does it have for me as a spiritual seeker to know about non-duality? So I hope I can help you reduce the confusion. We'll see. Perhaps I just add to the confusion. Who knows? But what I'd like to do is start with a statement that many people consider to be the basis for a non-dual understanding or a non-dual approach. Some say that this statement is the quintessential non-dual statement. And it's generally attributed to an Indian leader in the past who was called Shankara, but many people also associate it with Ramana Maharshi, who by many is considered the most prominent promoter of a non-dual approach in the modern age. So here's the statement. Only Brahman is real, the world is an illusion. Now, if you step back a little bit from that statement, you will see that it actually defines a duality. In a sense, it's a dualistic statement. So how can it be the foundation for non-duality? What do I mean? Well, listen. Only Brahman is real. The world is an illusion. This is a typical dualistic definition, which goes back to what the Buddha 2,500 years ago talked about, the pairs. Today we can call it the dualistic polarities. In other words, on the one side there's something that's real, on the other side there's something that's unreal. Brahman equals real, the world equals illusion. So the statement itself defines a duality. There's Brahman and there's the world. Now, this statement is really a fundamental misunderstanding of what non-duality is about. And it's very unfortunate because it goes way back. In fact, the whole idea that there's a contrast between Brahman on one side and the world on the other goes way back in India to the Vedas, to the Upanishads 2,800 years ago. And in Buddhism, there are also some Buddhist schools that talk about this. And if you look at this historically, this very idea has caused immense suffering and immense problems for spiritual people. And if you look at today, this idea is still causing immense suffering and confusion for spiritual people. What you see in India is, historically, there has been this Brahman is the only reality, therefore I should strive to reunite with Brahman, and therefore, since the world is an enemy of this striving, I have to forsake the world, abandon the world, ignore the world, discipline my body, discipline my mind, get over any kind of self. All of these things. And if you look at India historically, there have been these spiritual people who have ignored the world and focused on what they call spiritual pursuits. And the result was that the majority of the Indian population lived in abject poverty. They still live, most Indians, in severe poverty, greater poverty in the West, where there has been more of a focus on the practical aspect of life. So many spiritual people will say, well, the West is non-spiritual or anti-spiritual, but the Indian approach is spiritual. But is it? Is there really any of these approaches that is more spiritual than the other? They are just focused on two different aspects of life. Now, back to the statement. Only Brahman is real, the world is an illusion. Let's pick it apart a little bit. Let's take a closer look at it. Now, I'm not disagreeing that there is a fundamental reality that is undivided and that is the one unified reality behind all the phenomena you see in the world. I agree that there is that. There is a unity, there is a oneness behind all the phenomena in the world. But does that really mean that the world is an illusion? Now, when you look at these people, whether it's Advaita Vedanta, the modern teachers, or the Vedic teachers, they very rarely ask the question, at least as far as I can find, where did the world come from? Why is the world here? Why is there a world? Why isn't there just Brahman, the undifferentiated Brahman? So let's try and go back. We can't really say we are going back in time because in Brahman there is, of course, no time. But what we can say is, and I'm not sure everybody will agree with it, but I think most people will agree with it, that if only Brahman is real and the world is an illusion, there must have been a time where there was no world. In other words, there was a point beyond time where only Brahman existed. There was only Brahman. So how did the world come into being? Well, if there was only Brahman, it must have been Brahman who created the world. Where else would it come from? Right? So, if Brahman created the world, how can the world be an illusion? I mean, Brahman is real, right? Now, I know that in India, they often look at Brahman, or Brahman as some people pronounce it, as not really the personal God that we have in the West, but an impersonal state of energy or consciousness. But to me, when you look at this, you have to say that there has to be at least an aspect of Brahman that has consciousness. Brahman must have been able to decide, I'm going to create a world. Brahman must have in its mind been able to envision what kind of world it wanted to create, what forms it would contain, what rules and laws that would be guiding the unfoldment of the world. And then Brahman must have been able to bring this world into manifestation. Now, if only Brahman is real, if only Brahman exists, Brahman, or the creator as I prefer to call it, must have created the world out of itself, out of its own being, out of its own essence, out of its own consciousness and energy. So here we have this creative being who creates the world out of itself, out of its own being, and in full awareness of what it is creating. So, in the mind of Brahman, or the creator, where's the room for illusion? Where's the room for duality between Brahman and the world? Wouldn't Brahman see the world as an expression of itself? And wouldn't Brahman see that behind all of the forms in the world, there is Brahman, there is its own being and consciousness? That even though there are many different forms, they all came out of the same source. And therefore they are all connected, all united in that source. As incidentally, modern science, quantum physics, has proven that everything is connected, that the world is one interdependent whole. So my point here is that when you look at the non-dual teachings out there, they are all based on this particular statement. Brahman is real, the world is unreal. We have to overcome the world in order to reunite with Brahman. This is the goal of spirituality. This is, some people see it as the highest spiritual teaching. But how is that really spiritual? If Brahman created the world out of its own being, then why would Brahman see a contradiction or a duality between the world and itself? So what sense does it make that we can only be spiritual by running away from the world that Brahman has created? Let's just step back and look at ourselves, right? We experience there is a world, but more than that, we experience that we exist as self-aware beings. Now, Eastern philosophy generally says Brahman is undifferentiated. There's no duality in Brahman. But we are obviously differentiated. We are individual, distinct beings. And the world we live in is differentiated because there are all these different forms that are set apart from each other. A circle is different from a square, which is different from a triangle, which is different from the sun, which is different from the moon, all of these things. So we are part of Brahman's creation. We exist in Brahman's creation. Why is the only way to be spiritual to ignore or forsake Brahman's creation that we are part of? Does it really make sense that Brahman created us out of its own being, sent us into this world that Brahman has created out of its own being, and all Brahman wants us to do in this world is to forsake the world and return to Brahman? Couldn't there be some other reason why we're here? So what I'm simply trying to say with this video is there's a fundamental misunderstanding that underlies most Eastern philosophies. And this misunderstanding says only Brahman is non-dual. But as soon as you have different forms, as soon as you have differentiation, you have duality. In other words, what they're actually saying, and I'm not sure they would agree with this because that's probably not how they're thinking, but if you take the logical consequence of what they're saying that Brahman created a duality as soon as it created something that had form. In other words, there was Brahman, which was all unified, but as soon as Brahman created something that was differentiated from itself, it created a duality, a basic duality. And the world can never escape duality. And we who are in the world can never escape duality. We can never get away from duality unless we get away from the world and return to Brahman. This is what they're saying. What I'm saying is, does that really make sense? Does it resonate? It doesn't resonate with me intuitively because it ignores the purpose for why Brahman created the world and why Brahman created us. Why would Brahman create this elaborate, enormously complex world, create us as part of that world, and the only purpose Brahman has is that we should ignore the world instead of trying to figure out what is the world, how does it work, what is our role in it? Why did Brahman put us here? Was it really just to ignore the whole thing? Forsake the world? Look down upon what Brahman created and say, no, there's something fundamentally wrong with the world? So what I'm saying here is this. The fundamental misunderstanding in most teachings about non-duality is that differentiation is the same as duality. But what I'm trying to say is that from the viewpoint of Brahman, differentiation and duality have nothing to do with each other. You cannot create a world without differentiation, because there must be forms that are set apart from each other. So what is then duality? Duality is an illusion about the world and the nature of the world. So you could say, if you take this statement, only Brahman is real, the world is an illusion, you could say that a higher understanding of this would be only Brahman is ultimately real, but the illusion is that the world is separated from Brahman, that the world is different from Brahman. That is the illusion about the world. The world itself is not an illusion. The earth is real. It's just not ultimately real because it's not permanent, unchanging, eternal. And it didn't create itself. It doesn't exist by itself. It's created out of the consciousness of Brahman, the substance of Brahman, the being of Brahman. So it's not separated from Brahman in Brahman's mind. So where is the duality? Where is the separation? It's in our minds. Brahman is not confused about what is created. Brahman sees no duality. Sees no opposition between itself and the world. But we do. And so the real quintessential question about non-duality is, why are we in a different state of consciousness where we don't experience the underlying unity and oneness, where we don't experience our source and where we came from? Why are we in a dualistic state of consciousness that we need to overcome in order to experience our non-dual origin? How did we get in that state of consciousness? Now, there are some modern teachers that try to explain this. They don't even talk about Brahman, they talk about infinite awareness. Infinite awareness manifested itself as the world. Infinite awareness manifested itself as us. But then infinite awareness forgot that it's infinite awareness. And that's why we have to remember that we are infinite awareness. I don't know about you, but I listen to this and I'm saying, it doesn't resonate. I mean, look at the statement. Infinite awareness, right? Supposedly, how can there be anything that infinite awareness isn't aware of? So how can infinite awareness in our minds forget about itself? No, there is something in our minds that makes it possible for us to forget where we came from. And that is what I call the duality consciousness, what the Buddha 2,500 years ago talked about as the consciousness that's dominated by the pairs. He called it Maya, the illusion, or ignorance. Ignorance is when you don't realize where you came from. Jesus talked about the same thing. He just used different words, and he called it actually the consciousness of death. Let the dead bury their dead. And so there is a consciousness in the world. And how can we claim to begin to deal with the topic of non-duality if we don't first have a thorough understanding of the consciousness of duality that keeps us from experiencing non-duality? And that's why the big question I have about all these non-dual teachers out there is, why are they never talking about duality and the consciousness of duality? Why are they only talking about this far-flung goal of non-dual awareness? Why are they saying, for example, that you can't walk a systematic path that is guaranteed to lead you to non-dual awareness? So some say you shouldn't do anything. You should just sit and wait for the clouds to part where you are spontaneously enlightened and now you are in non-dual awareness. Why don't they talk about what keeps us out of non-dual awareness? So that is what I will talk about in the coming videos. But the topic I really wanted to focus on in this video was this misunderstanding. Differentiation is not the same as duality. There's no fundamental duality in the world. Brahman did not create a duality between itself and the world. Duality is a state of mind. It's an illusion that exists in our minds. And if we want to understand something about non-duality, and if we want to experience non-duality, we have to start by understanding duality and the duality consciousness. So I'll talk about that next.